Good afternoon to all of you. Good afternoon to all of you.
Yes.
Point it to the back.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so I'll begin as they help me with that. Land was one of the reasons for the struggle for independence in Kenya. Kenya was part of what was known as the British East African Protectorate, thus British colony. And this included local communities being displaced from their lands as the white settlers created their state. For example, there's a famous term, I don't know if some of you have ever heard of it, of the White Highlands. This is land that stretches from the central part of Kenya up to parts of the western part, which include the best land in Kenya, most arable, most fertile. So one of the communities that was displaced by this was the Kikuyu community. They were pushed into settlement schemes, and there was a lot of congestion, led them to poverty, and you can understand land being at the center of the life of an African person, traditional Kenyan communities, this was a grievous situation, and it led to the Mau Mau uprising that led to the struggle for independence in Kenya. So another community that was also moved because of this was the Maasai community. They used to own up to the land that is current Nairobi, was Maasai land. So they were pushed into settlement schemes also. Them being herders, were used to having large parcels of land, looking for pasture for their animals. So the colonialism also displaced them. And the last communities are the Mijikenda community that are found in the coastal regions of Kenya, where we see the 10-mile coastal strip. The African locals were pushed into settlement schemes, and it brought a lot of injustices to the locals. So colonialism also introduced a foreign concept of ownership of land, that is state ownership of land. African communities had communal land, community land. Land was owned by the community in general. For example, my community is called the Luya community, and specifically the Maragoli sub-tribe. So land was owned by the tribe, and under the tribe, the modern day individual was related to the family. Family was the smallest unit in traditional African setting. Colonialism changed this system, and where all the land was owned by the state in the center, and rights were given to the communities from the state. So in our case in Kenya, colonialism opened the doors of land crisis. So independence came, and the new government of Kenya adopted most of the laws that were ruling during the colonial times with very minimal changes. So we had a number of laws that were dealing with land in Kenya, including the Registration of Titles Act, Government Lands Act, Land Titles Act, Registered Land Act, the Land Group Representatives Act, the Trust Land Act, and the Sectional Properties Act, number 21 of 1987, and the Indian Transfer of Property Rights Act also. So these laws were numerous and were complex, and also administered to different parts of the country, bringing a kind of discrimination. So the people of Kenya were looking towards independence as, bringing freedom, and the colonial injustices will be amended, but this did not happen. State ownership opened up the floodgates of corruption in Kenya, and land grabbing and irregular allocation of land became commonplace. So we have a lot of land being grabbed by state officers and people in their networks. We're also facing a time where there's population increase. We're also facing a time of urbanization with people moving from the rural areas into the urban centers. There's a lot of pressure, and during this time, the emergence of slums in Kenya came up. Kenya is home to the largest slum in East and Central Africa called Kibera, and I happen to live very close to it. It's really rough. And this is just one of the many slums we have. So this is a map of Kenya, which is it's not such a big country, and only 20% of the land in the country is arable land. That's the dark green spots. And the lighter green spots are land where crop can grow. But as you can see from the region, most of Kenya is semi-arid and arid. 80% of the Kenyan population depends on agriculture as a source of livelihood. Then you can understand, like, considering that Kenyan communities consider land to be the center of their livelihoods. And unfortunately for us, we are not so blessed naturally. There's a lot of pressure, and land was a serious issue. We had a lot of tribal clashes that were deadly as communities fought for land. We have pastoralist communities in the northern part of Kenya that like the Pokot and the Turkana, who have known to fight for years and deadly wars. They have guns as they fight for pasture. And we've also seen cases where they would come to privately owned land and kill owners. I think this happened last year in the struggle for looking for pasture for the animals. So land issues have been a serious crisis for us in Kenya, which affected the economy, our society, and the political setup of the country. So what happened? What did we do about this? In 2003, we had a change in governance where our long-term dictator, President Moi, was taken home. And we had a new system of, totally new government that was voted in through the coalition of different opposition parties that came up. This is under President Mwai Kibaki. There was no national land policy since independence in the country. And because of all these issues I have mentioned, there was need to come up with one. In 2004, a team of experts led by the Ministry of Land formulated the national land policy, which was adopted in 2007. And some of the highlights of the national land policy included classification of land. So we now have land classified into public land, private land, and community land to consider the communities that wish to maintain their cultural practices. And so they can actually go and get a title for land as a community. It's now possible. Previously, this was not possible. It also introduced the National Land Commission. Previously, land was being administered by the government through the Ministry of Lands. So the National Land Policy introduced an independent institution, the National Land Commission, to administer over land and property in the country. It also condensed the numerous and complex laws we had to only 3 laws: the Land Act, the Land Registration Act, and the National Land Commission Act. It also provided for ownership of land by foreigners. Previously in Kenya, a person who wasn't a citizen could own land up to 1,000 years on freehold tenure, like absolute proprietorship. Unfortunately, considering the situation of corruption in the country and irregular allocation of land, there was some unfair issues happening. The Constitution converted this into a leasehold tenure of a maximum of 99 years at a time. So any person who is not a Kenyan citizen can own land in Kenya under leasehold tenure, and at the end of 99 years, you may apply for extension of the lease. So previously, we didn't have security of land rights, but as the new national land policy restricted the time a foreigner could own land, but it also made sure that a person who owns land will have the rights secured. And the national land policy also reviewed government powers that included we call compulsory acquisition, we don't use the term expropriation, and also development control. And for us, compulsory acquisition is the government taking your land, which the new expropriation without compensation law in South Africa is meant to take away land without compensation. But in Kenya, the government can only do this as guided by the law, and it has to be just and equitable, and it has to be fair. The government can only take your land after they've done a study of the current market rate and the value of your property and give you what is deserved. And the owner of land also has access to the courts to contest that acquisition interest by the government. So the Constitution of Kenya was reviewed in 2010. The country we had a referendum and voted for a new constitution. So we're coming from years of dictatorship, colonial injustices, and there was need for a new constitution, and one of the major issues was land. So the constitution adopted the national land policy, which is in Chapter 5 of the Constitution of Kenya 2010. Article 40, which is under the Bill of Rights in Chapter 4, provides for property rights. And some of the highlights of this article are that a person cannot, there shouldn't be any arbitrary deprivation of property rights of a person. There shouldn't be discrimination, and a person also should not be limited in how they are to enjoy their rights. It should be legal. And any acquisition by the government should be equitable and just, and that it should be with just compensation that is prompt. So the Constitution of Kenya also under Article 162 provides for a special court that didn't exist previously. It's called the Environment and Land Court, specifically to try matters that deal with land and environment matters. So we never had such an opportunity where people whose land has been taken away, who never got justice, had a platform to go and fight for their rights. But the new constitution brought this court that can try matters affecting land, property, and environment matters. This today is one of the most busiest courts in the country. So this proposed law, expropriation without compensation, is against one universal human right, which is protection of property rights. And you can find this is in the UN Charter. All the countries in the world need to have this in their constitution and adopt it. So property rights is a key right to a person's well-being, to a person's living. And this law seeks to threaten that, which will adversely affect the economy of South Africa. Kenya, like South Africa, I would say is a multicultural community. And we are host to an Asian community, Arab community, a few white settlers, immigrants who are coming from neighboring communities due to war, and also refugees. Kenya has one of the largest refugees in the continent, Dadaab camp. So in our case, the government had to be very careful when it was creating any law touching on land. It had to take account of the multicultural society that we have today. For us in Kenya, the question isn't on black or white. The question is on citizen and non-citizen. And even if you're not a citizen, so long as you are an investor and you're interested in the land and you're investing and bringing money to the country, the government must ensure that you have property rights and that your investment is secure for the benefit of the country and the people of Kenya and the economy. I see this law bringing in a system of racial segregation, a kind of a modern apartheid, because we know here today that this law seeks to target white-owned land. It's starting with targeting the white farmers. Tomorrow it will target the Kenyans and the Nigerians and Ethiopians who are working here. And the next day it's going to target African, black South Africans. So this law is not going to help the economy of South Africa, but it will lead the country in an economic catastrophe. It will open floodgates of corruption. I come from a country where we are on the list of corruption. After Nigeria, I think Kenya comes second. And this is something that we are really struggling with. Our president has said he is waging war against corruption. We've seen our anti-corruption commission raising, cases have been brought up, billions have been stolen, but unfortunately for us, we haven't seen people being brought to book. So corruption is a serious issue we're dealing with in Kenya. And one of the things that enabled it was laws that gave the government too much power, which means all you had to do to become rich in Kenya was make sure you get yourself into the Ministry of Land. And once you're there, you have access to thousands of acres of land, you and your circle, and you take your money to the Swiss accounts and you live happily ever after, while I, who has no choice, will have to suffer the adverse effects. South Africa today, I would say, is the star of Africa. Very beautiful economy. It's large. The system is working. I usually ask someone, well, if you haven't been to US or Europe, just go to South Africa. The experience is the same. But local South Africans, many of whom haven't traveled to sub-Saharan Africa and outside, have no idea what it is like. Have no idea what it means not to have opportunities, have no idea what it feels like not to have light for a month. Ask someone who lives in Lagos how they manage. You know, a generator is a basic need. In Nigeria, there's no light. You have to find your own water. For us now, we have cartels in the cities who cut our water and you have to buy from the Gauzas. The Gauzas are owned by the politicians. So our life is very difficult because of we once upon a time enabled the government to have so much power that today we are still struggling with the adverse effects, despite us moving away from it. Zimbabwe only implemented one policy that has brought the giant of Africa and the food basket of Africa on its knees. I don't think I need to say more, but I hope that South Africans will not pass this law, as we shall see the Star of Africa fall from its glory. Thank you.
I thought you'd stop.